The morning mist clung to the heather-lined hedgerows of Dorset like a memory unwilling to be forgotten. A pale autumn sun filtered through the thinning leaves, illuminating the sweeping lawns of Greybourne Hall, an old country house nestled on a rise overlooking the coastal cliffs. The house, built of grey stone and ivy, possessed that particular kind of quiet grandeur which seemed to whisper of family secrets and forgotten wars. It was the kind of place that had endured generations and with them accumulated the of human drama, faded portraits of stern-looking ancestors, clocks that ticked slightly off-beat, and corridors where footsteps always sounded as though they were not your own. At the edge of the south lawn, beyond a low stone wall, the garden sloped into a thicket of trees. It was there that Miss Letitia Greybourne, the current mistress of the house, stood in her thick wool coat, her gloved hands folded tightly before her, as she surveyed the preparations for the annual harvest luncheon. She was tall, bony, and impeccably dressed in tweed, a woman whose presence seemed to lower temperatures by several degrees. Her steely grey hair was wound into a chignon as uncompromising as her temperament. Be sure the tables are spaced exactly 4 feet apart, she instructed the estate gardener, who nodded nervously and adjusted a folding table accordingly. And I will not have chrysanthemums this year. They remind me of funerals. The gardener murmured something indistinct, wiped his brow, and returned to arranging the vases of autumn flowers on the trestle tables. To the casual observer, there was no indication that Greybourne Hall was anything other than the embodiment of stately rural life. But inside the house, in a small drawing room off the west corridor, a girl of about 10 sat cross-legged on the carpet, a crayon in one hand and a thick sheet of sketch paper in front of her. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth. She was not one of the Greybournes, nor indeed anyone of note, merely the housekeeper's granddaughter, Emily Dawes. Staying for the weekend while her mother recovered from an operation in Dorchester, she drew in silence, except for the occasional scratching of crayon on paper, entirely absorbed. Her drawing was of the garden, not as it was now, but how it had once been, in the girl's mind. The trees fuller, a swing hanging from the old elm, and 2 figures standing beside the rose arbor, a woman with a parasol and a small child holding her hand. Emily frowned. Something was missing. She drew a door at the base of the house, a small one tucked between 2 buttresses. She had seen it once, opened briefly during the summer when men came to fix the pipes, a door that led somewhere dark, perhaps underground. She added a red scribble near the door, uncertain why. Then she folded the drawing, tucked it into her satchel and skipped off to the kitchen for tea. Elsewhere in the house, Dr. Giles Everett, a local GP with thinning hair and an expression that, it seemed, permanently tinged with suspicion, leaned against the marble fireplace in the parlor. Opposite him sat Colonel Marcus Greybourne, retired from the Indian Army, and now master of the Hall, though some whispered that Letitia, his elder sister, still held the real power. I must say, said Dr. Everett, stirring his tea without interest, there's a peculiar atmosphere in this house of late. Colonel Greybourne raised an eyebrow. In what way peculiar? Giles, the doctor looked at the door, then lowered his voice. It's this business with the staff. The butler handing in his resignation without so much as a reason. Mrs. Dawes claiming she hears footsteps in the service corridors at night. And young Emily's sweet child woke up last week saying there was a lady crying outside her room. The colonel gave a gruff snort. Nonsense. Letitia's always been hard on the staff. But if Dawes is hearing footsteps, it's more likely mice than ghosts. But you admit it's unsettling, especially in light of ... Well, you know. The 2 men fell silent. The fire popped and crackled between them. It was a long time ago, said the colonel finally, and none of our concern now. That afternoon, guests began to arrive for the harvest luncheon. There was Mr. Edmund Carlyle, the village solicitor, young, dashing, and slightly too charming for Letitia's liking. Mrs. Isabel Wayland, a wealthy widow who had recently returned to the village and seemed determined to reinsert herself into its every affair. Rev. Simon Latham, the clergyman, with a secret fondness for sherry, and a few others, farmers, minor landowners, and the new schoolmistress with painfully sensible shoes. Among them was a tall, balding man with a splendid moustache and a tailored overcoat that seemed curiously foreign in its cut. He stepped out of a hired motor car with delicacy and surveyed the hall with a kind of clinical interest. Monsieur Hercule Poirot, on holiday in the West Country, had been invited by Isabel Wayland, whom he had once met at a charitable event in Brussels. I do so hope you'll come, she had written. The Greybournes are most interesting, and I believe this part of the country may appeal to your sensibilities. He had intended to decline, but something about the letter had intrigued him, a turn of phrase perhaps, or the way Isabel had written that the hall had forgotten rooms and locked wings. And so, the great detective had come to Greybourne. By the evening, as laughter echoed across the lawns and cider was poured liberally beneath the lanterns, no one had yet noticed that little Emily Dawes had not come down for supper. It was only when Mrs. Dawes, her grandmother, went up to check on her and found the bedroom empty and the bed unslept in that the unease began to swell. They searched the garden, then the hedges, then the house. The small door by the buttresses was found unlocked. Emily was not found at all. The night descended with a peculiar stillness, broken only by the dry rasp of wind against the stone walls of Greybourne Hall. The laughter and gaiety of the harvest luncheon had long since given way to hushed voices and quick glances, as the reality of the missing child settled like a shadow over the estate. By 10 o'clock, the guests had departed, their expressions marked with concern and veiled curiosity. No one wished to be present when panic took hold, not in a house where history whispered behind every tapestry. Inside the drawing-room, the tension was as thick as the velvet curtains that had been drawn against the dark. A single lamp cast golden light over the faces of those gathered. Letitia Greybourne seated stiffly upright, Colonel Greybourne, grim and scowling, Mrs. Dawes trembling and pale, and Hercule Poirot, who stood calmly by the fireplace, his hands folded before him like a professor awaiting the arrival of his students. Poirot's expression was thoughtful, not alarmed, but his eyes, sharp, dark and observant, moved carefully from one face to another. "She is not in the garden," said the colonel brusquely. "We've searched every inch, the thickets, the rosebeds, even the folly near the hedge maze. No sign." "And the hall?" asked Poirot. "Every room on the main floors has been checked," Letitia replied. "There are only a few unused rooms in the west wing, locked, most of them, but no child could access them." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Pardon me, madame. Children often go where adults assume they cannot. It is their nature." Mrs. Dawes let out a soft sob. "She's a good girl, sir, quiet, keeps to herself. She wouldn't just run off." Poirot stepped toward her with a gentleness that seemed to deflate the fear in her posture. "You say she was last seen before tea?" The housekeeper nodded. "I sent her up to change into a green dress. She liked that one, said it was lucky. That was before the luncheon. I assumed she'd wandered down after and joined the guests. No one noticed she hadn't, and no note, no drawing left behind." Mrs. Dawes blinked. "Drawing, sir? Miss Emily had a sketchbook. I noticed it earlier when I passed the garden. A child so observant surely recorded something of interest today." The colonel shifted uneasily. "You think she may have seen something?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the window and tugged back the curtain just an inch. Outside, the garden was bathed in moonlight, and beyond it, the narrow path that led toward the side of the house, toward the little door beneath the ivy. "Would you show me the door?" Poirot asked quietly. They emerged into the cold night, Poirot leading the way with swift, deliberate steps. The ivy rustled as he brushed it aside, revealing the small wooden door fitted snugly between two protruding buttresses. Its black iron latch gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Poirot knelt and examined the handle. It was slightly ajar. "It was locked this morning," Letitia said behind him. "I'm sure of it. It's hardly ever used. Just a service entrance to the old cellars." Poirot opened the door gently. A gust of damp air met them, stale, earthy, touched with mildew. He stepped inside, producing a small electric torch from his coat pocket. The beam danced across stone steps, narrow and uneven, descending into darkness. He paused at the threshold. "You will forgive me," he said without turning, "but I must go alone. The steps are narrow, and too many feet would disturb what little evidence may remain." Without waiting for a reply, Poirot vanished into the gloom. The cellar beneath Greybourne Hall was more expansive than one would expect, a winding labyrinth of cold rooms, unused wine racks, and forgotten trunks. The air smelled of disuse, and old coal. Poirot moved slowly, noting the scuff marks on the stone floor, the way dust had been disturbed in patches, and in one far corner, beneath a rotting wooden shelf, something glinted. He crouched and retrieved it, a wax crayon, green dot, neared. It was a scrap of paper, partially torn, a child's drawing. A crude figure in black stood next to a red door. Above it, in a childish scrawl, were the words, "Not her real face." Poirot stared at the drawing for a long time, then he straightened and turned back toward the steps. By the time he returned, the rest of the house had been roused. Flashlights flickered across the garden, and the distant bark of a dog echoed as a local constable arrived. Poirot re-entered the drawing room and handed the torn paper to Letitia without a word. She studied it, her eyes narrowing. "Where did you find this?" "In the cellar, near the back." The colonel frowned. "But the cellar hasn't been used since—" "Well, not in years." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Since when, precisely?" There was a long silence. Then Letitia said flatly, "Since 1930, after the incident with Cecily." Mrs. Dawes let out a sharp gasp. "Cecily." Letitia's voice was clipped. "Our younger sister, she was mentally delicate. We kept it quiet, as one did in those days. She had ... episodes, and one day she simply disappeared. The police found no evidence. It was ruled a wandering death. Lost to the cliffs." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "And where was her room?" Letitia turned her head slightly, her lips pale. "The west wing, but it's been locked ever since." Poirot walked slowly to the fireplace, then turned. "There is something curious here, mes amis. A child draws a door that no one speaks of. A cellar, long unused, bears fresh signs of entry. A girl vanishes, and a long-lost drawing refers to a face that is not real." He tapped the paper gently. "This was not simply mischief. Mademoiselle Emily saw something. something she tried to capture in her drawing. Dr. Everett, who had just entered with a worried look, spoke then. "You believe she is still in the house?" Poirot's voice was low and deliberate. "I believe she never truly left." The rain came in the early hours, a slow, steady drizzle that slicked the slate roof of Greybourne Hall and crept in mournful streaks down the mullioned windows. It blurred the landscape outside into watery smudges of green and grey, as though the house itself wished to conceal whatever truth lay within. Inside, however, everything was clear to Hercule Poirot, or rather, almost clear. He had spent the better part of the night seated in a high-backed chair in the drawing-room, not speaking, not moving, only occasionally rubbing a finger across the edge of his mustache as his mind worked tirelessly. When morning broke and the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8, Poirot stood and quietly requested that Colonel Greybourne summoned everyone who resided within the house, family, staff, and guests still present. They assembled in the morning room, a long chamber, filled with family portraits and oil paintings of hunting dogs and horses long dead. The atmosphere was subdued, faces drawn and voices low. A small fire crackled in the grate, doing little to lift the chill that clung to the panelled walls. Poirot, ever meticulous, stood before them with a kind of gentle authority. "We must work quickly, Madame et Messieurs. Every hour that passes is a loss. A child is missing, and I believe the key lies here, in this house." He glanced around the room. "We begin with the west wing. Madame Letitia, if you please." The key. Letitia Greybourne, still as composed as a marble statue, did not flinch. She produced a small brass key from a velvet pouch and handed it to Poirot wordlessly. "The doors have remained locked for years," she said coldly. "They will be dusty, unpleasant." Poirot nodded. "I have encountered worse." The west wing had an altogether different character from the rest of Greybourne Hall. The air was colder, the windows, long shuttered, filtered in little light. Dust coated the floors in a thick, undisturbed layer. The passage was narrow and lined with faded wallpaper, its floral patterns long faded to a shadow of color. Poirot walked slowly, observing everything. At the far end was a door slightly smaller than the others. It bore no nameplate, no brass handle, just a keyhole. He inserted the brass key, turned it, and the door creaked open. The room within was as untouched as a photograph frozen in time. A faded rug covered the floor, and a narrow iron bed sat against one wall. A doll lay on the bed, its porcelain face cracked. A shelf of books sagged wearily beside the window. An old rocking chair faced outward, turned toward the distant cliffs. Poirot stepped inside, allowing the others to remain at the threshold. He moved toward a chest of drawers and opened the top one gently. Inside were hair ribbons, pressed flowers, and a child's diary. Poirot picked it up. The first few pages were blank. Then a shaky juvenile hand appeared. "March 6th. Nurse says I mustn't talk to her, but she talks to me anyway. She sings at night when the others are asleep. Her face is wrong. March 9th. I saw her in the mirror again. She doesn't blink when I do. March 17th. She was angry last night. She said they locked her down there. She doesn't like the dark. I drew her picture so I won't forget." Poirot stopped reading. He closed the diary and turned. "You said, madame, that your sister Cecily disappeared." Letitia stood rigidly in the doorway. "Yes." Poirot's voice was calm. "But she did not vanish from a picnic or a stroll along the cliffs, did she?" Letitia's silence was answer enough. Poirot stepped aside and gestured toward the room. "She vanished from here, and this room was left precisely as it was, preserved, hidden. Why?" Colonel Greybourne interjected, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "We wished to remember her as she was, not to disturb what little peace remained." Poirot's expression sharpened. "Peace, monsieur, or guilt?" Letitia's face did not change, but her eyes flickered, just once. Poirot moved to the window. The view stretched across the garden to the far hedge, and beyond that the sea. But to the right, tucked beneath the rise, the stone service wing nestled into the earth like a forgotten memory. Poirot turned back. She believed someone was locked below. A woman who spoke to her, a woman whose face was wrong. "Tell me, did Cecily suffer from hallucinations?" Letitia's reply came reluctantly. "She had ... episodes. She would sometimes invent things." Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then he held up the diary. "This is not invention, madame. This is fear. Sustained, vivid, consistent. This girl was not imagining a ghost. She was recording something or someone real." Later that morning, Poirot requested access to the estate's architectural plans, which were eventually produced from a tin case kept in the butler's old quarters. Unfolding them carefully in the library, he examined the foundation levels, the service routes, and most importantly the wine cellars beneath the east and west wings. Then he saw a section marked storage subchamber, walled off in 1930, adjacent to the main cellar but with no recorded access point. Poirot pressed a finger to the diagram. "There," he murmured. With the reluctant help of the gardener and the village constable, Poirot led a quiet excavation of the flagged stone wall in the cellar, directly across from where Emily's drawing had been found. It took 3 hours of effort, and when the last stone was pried away, it revealed a narrow, man-sized gap leading into a pitch-dark space. The air that rushed out was foul, not merely stale, but tinged with rotten dust and something older still. Poirot stepped back. No one enters until we have proper light, and I request, at once, that Dr. Everett join us." A torch was lowered inside. The light revealed 2 gasps from those watching, a small iron bed, a rotted armchair, and dozens of yellowed paper scraps littered across the floor. In the corner, slumped, skeletal, wrapped in the remnants of a housemaid's uniform, lay the body of a woman. The constable swallowed hard. "Dear God." Poirot bent and retrieved one of the paper scraps, a child's drawing, a woman's face, but the eyes were shaded black, crossed out again and again. Poirot turned to the group. "This is not the body of Miss Emily Dawes. It is much older, and yet I fear her disappearance is tied to this hidden chamber. Someone did not want the past disturbed. Someone who believed that the dead must stay hidden, even if it costs the living." His voice dropped. "And yet, it is always the forgotten things, the child's drawing, the closed door, the silent room that speak loudest in the end." The discovery of the hidden chamber sent ripples through Greybourne Hall. By noon the news had spread beyond the house to the village, where theories bloomed like weeds in damp soil. The body, long dead and decayed, was removed under the supervision of Dr. Everett and the constable, who both looked paler than usual for the rest of the day. No one spoke of it at lunch. Plates were served in silence, and even Letitia, who usually insisted on strict table decorum, did not object when the servants forgot the wine. Poirot, however, remained preternaturally calm. He sipped tea in the morning room as though nothing unusual had happened, his sharp eyes watching everyone with quiet interest. It was not until late afternoon that he requested a private conversation with Mrs. Dawes, the housekeeper. They met in the butler's pantry, a small room lined with old oak cupboards and the smell of polish and starch. The window rattled faintly in the breeze. "You have served the Greyburns for how long, madame?" Poirot asked, his tone gentle. 24 years, sir," she replied, wringing her hands in her apron. "Came on just after old Mr. Greybourne passed." "You knew the sister, Miss Cecily?" She hesitated. "Only a little. She kept to her room most of the time. The staff were told not to engage her, and truth be told, most of us were glad of it. Strange girl, always scribbling in books, talking to herself." "Was she violent?" Mrs. Dawes looked alarmed. "No, sir, never that. Quiet. But she'd look through you, if you take my meaning, as though she saw something in you you'd rather keep hidden." Poirot nodded. "And the maid who vanished, the one whose body we found, do you know who she might have been?" "I've no idea. No one's spoken of a missing maid. But the records, they're spotty. Many came and went after the war. Some were never formally registered." Poirot leaned in slightly. "Madam, if someone had something to hide, a mistake, a tragedy, a shameful act, would they not be tempted to bury it so deep that even their own memory refused to uncover it?" Mrs. Dawes trembled. "You think that's what happened to my Emily?" "I think," he said slowly, "that Emily saw something she was not meant to see, and someone feared she would tell." That evening, Poirot asked to see Miss Letitia Greybourne alone in her private sitting room, a cold, stark chamber filled with stiff-backed chairs, ticking clocks, and severe oil paintings of long-dead clergy. Letitia stood as he entered but did not offer him a seat. "I've no patience for melodrama, Monsieur Poirot. I understand your reputation, but we've already involved the constabulary. Surely the police are better suited to locating a child." "Ah," Poirot said, holding up a finger. "But the police, they concern themselves with surface facts. I, however, am more interested in the rot beneath the wallpaper." She turned sharply. "If you're suggesting this house is somehow responsible, I am suggesting," he interrupted gently, "that houses have memories, madame, and so do families, but some memories are kept locked away, like the West Wing." She said nothing. Poirot studied her for a moment. "Miss Letitia, your sister did not disappear in innocence. She was ill, yes, but not mad. She wrote of a woman with the wrong face, a woman locked beneath the floor. And we have now found her." Letitia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Cecily was fragile or truthful, perhaps more truthful than those around her could bear." She looked away, and Poirot noticed her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She was prone to fantasy, and she developed obsessions with the servants, with one in particular. He said nothing, waiting. Letitia exhaled slowly. Her name was Alice Dawn, a housemaid. Cecily became infatuated with her, wrote her letters, confessed undying devotion. It was scandalous. Our father had her dismissed immediately." Alice Dawn, Poirot repeated. "Not simply dismissed. I suspect." Letitia's face twitched. "There was an incident. Cecily claimed she'd been locked away from her by the family, accused us of cruelty, said we were monsters. And then, one night, she vanished, and she was never seen again. The official story was that she ran off with a sailor. I never believed it." Poirot nodded once. "But you said nothing to the police?" "There was too much shame. We were a respectable family." Poirot stepped forward, his voice now low and edged with steel. "And in protecting that respectability, you condemned a servant girl to a secret grave, and your sister to a legacy of madness." Letitia said nothing. Her composure cracked for only a moment. Her breath caught, her hands trembled, then the mask returned. "I did what was necessary," she said. Poirot bowed slightly. "Yes, madame, and someone else, I fear, has done so again." That night, As the wind howled outside and rain battered the windows, Poirot made a request of Colonel Greyburn. "I must examine the nursery." The colonel looked puzzled. "But Emily's not a baby. She was using one of the guest rooms." "Indeed, but I am not speaking of her room. I mean the old nursery, the one used during your own childhood." The colonel frowned. "It's in the Upper East Corridor. No one's used it in decades." "Why?" Poirot gave a small smile. "Because I believe our missing girl may have gone looking for Cecily's past and someone ensured she would not return." When they unlocked the nursery door, a smell of mothballs and age greeted them. The wallpaper peeled at the edges. A broken rocking horse lay in the corner, and a dust-sheeted crib stood beneath the window. Poirot walked in slowly. His eyes scanned the corners, the faded toys, the chalkboard on the wall. Then he paused. On the board, faintly drawn beneath years of grime, was a crude figure, a little girl, standing beside a woman with a circle for a face, and in the corner a new drawing, fresher, smaller, a red crayon. The word "she." Poirot turned sharply. She was here. Emily was here. The constable stepped forward. "But there's no sign of her now, not even footprints." Poirot turned to the crib and reached behind it. His fingers found something. Soft, dotted green dress. Small, torn. Poirot's voice dropped. "She was taken from here." Greybourne Hall had grown colder with each passing hour. Even the fireplaces, which had been fed more regularly now that the damp had crept into the stone, could not entirely dispel the heavy hush that blanketed the house. Staff whispered in the kitchen's doors that had once been left open were now carefully closed. A house accustomed to secrets had become, in its silence, afraid of its own memory. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the nursery as dawn filtered pale and golden through the grimy window. He held the torn green dress in his hands, its hem frayed, one sleeve ripped, the collar speckled faintly with dust and something darker. He turned the fabric gently, not missing the single strand of blonde hair caught in the stitching. "Pauvre enfant," he murmured. "You saw what they forgot, and now someone wishes to forget you too." He folded the dress carefully, wrapping it in a linen napkin he had brought up from the kitchen. Then he turned to the chalkboard again. The drawings disturbed him not in their style. They were ordinary, childish, but in what they revealed. The first drawing, he believed, had been Cecily's, an outline of a child beside a faceless woman. It matched the entries from the old diary. Cecily had been trying to remember or possibly warn someone about the woman she saw, the one locked away. But the second drawing was Emily's. Of that, he was certain. The color, the size, the red crayon, all matched the others he had seen. The single word scrawled in her unsure hand. She chilled him. It was not just a warning, it was a command, and it suggested that someone had been in the room with her later that morning. Poirot asked the colonel for the staff records, all the servants currently employed, and those who had come and gone over the last 5 years. The colonel, stiff but compliant, had them brought up from the old records cupboard. Poirot sat in the library and examined them meticulously. Housemaids, footmen, kitchen help, a groundsman, 2 chauffeurs, and several temp hires for events. Most of the names meant little, but one caught his eye. G. Crawley, estate maintenance and general repairs. Retired 1939. He called for the constable. "This man Crawley, is he still in the village?" I said. "Constable Grant, lives out near the Mill Lane. Must be near 90 now, doesn't leave his cottage, but his mind's still sharp." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then he may be the only one in this place who remembers what the house itself cannot say." The visit to Mr. Geoffrey Crawley was a slow one. His cottage was small, wooden, and sagged on one side like a man dozing in a chair. Crawley himself was thin, weathered, and wore 2 scarves despite the warmth of the stove. When Poirot explained his interest, the old man chuckled dryly. "You're not the first to go poking around that hole," he said, squinting, "but maybe you'll be the first to understand it." "I am interested," Poirot said politely, "in the construction of the hall, particularly the west and east wings. The cellar, the nursery." Crawley scratched his beard. "Those places don't talk anymore, but I remember the work. Did repairs down there when I was a lad. Pipes mostly, but I remember the walls." Poirot leaned in. "Tell me, are there any passageways? Hidden doors?" Crawley's eyes twinkled. "Oh, plenty. It was all the rage 100 years ago. Panic rooms, priest holes, servants' hatches. Some lead nowhere now, bricked over or too dangerous to use. But the old hall was like a mouse's maze underneath. Especially the cellars. There's one passage I'll never forget. It runs beneath the east corridor. Used to connect the nursery to the old service stair. The door was hidden behind a false panel." Poirot's eyes lit up. "And is it still accessible?" "Doubt it," Crawley muttered. "Most of it collapsed in the 30s. That's why they closed off the west wing. Said the floor wasn't sound. But maybe, just maybe, ... He paused, eyes narrowing. There was a space between the 2 wings, almost forgotten. It was once a larder, but the family stopped using it. Damp crept in, might still be there." Poirot stood. "Monsieur Crawley, you have the gratitude of her..." "Poirot, I believe you have just illuminated a path, both literal and psychological." Back at Greybourne Hall, Poirot wasted no time. He requested that the constable and Colonel Greyburn accompany him to the east corridor. He moved slowly, counting panels as he walked, until he reached the 6th from the nursery door. With careful precision, he pressed one corner. There was a soft click. A piece of paneling shifted slightly. "Aha," Poirot whispered. Behind the panel was a narrow shaft of darkness, too small for an adult man, but perhaps just wide enough for a child. They shone torches inside. The air was thick, damp. Spiderwebs hung like drapes. Poirot turned to the constable. "You must be careful. I suspect this passage leads to the heart of the hall's secret." An hour later, the narrow passage had been partially cleared. The constable, smaller than most, had managed to squeeze through and report that the shaft opened into a small, bricked chamber, once a larder, as Crawley had said. But more chillingly, he had found something: a crumpled piece of paper, and a scarf. The scarf was green, and the paper was another drawing, Emily's style, a figure with a key in its hand. Behind it, a smaller figure trapped in a box. Poirot looked at the drawing, lips pressed tightly together. "She is not dead," he said at last. "Not yet, but she has been hidden, somewhere close." He looked at the image again. "A box," he murmured, "not a coffin, a space." And then it came to him: not a passage, not a cellar, not a tunnel, a dumbwaiter. Poirot whispered, "Of course." The search was swift now. Poirot and the constable made for the kitchen wing for old buildings. Like Rayburn often had dumbwaiters running vertically between floors. They found the shaft behind a service door, long disused. The crank was stiff, but not rusted shut. Poirot turned the wheel gently. There was resistance, then the faintest scrape. They looked down, and slowly, ever so slowly, the lift began to rise. At first, there was only blackness, then a shoe, a small green one, and finally curled up, unconscious but breathing Emily Dawes, pale and frightened, her hands clutching her sketchpad, like a lifeline. Poirot bent to her level as the constable called for Dr. Everett. "You are safe now, mon enfant," he said softly, but Emily did not open her eyes. Instead, she muttered just one thing. "The lady with no face," she said. "Come back." Dr. Everett worked swiftly, his leather bag rattling as he pulled out a stethoscope, a thermometer, and a small bottle of smelling salts. Emily, though pale and chilled to the touch, responded with a flutter of her eyelids and a faint groan. Hovered near the girl, his expression unreadable but his eyes fiercely intent. "She has been sedated," Everett said after a moment. "I can't say with what. Nothing fatal, thank God. Possibly laudanum or chloral hydrate, though it's wearing off now. She needs rest, warmth, fluids." Emily stirred weakly as Mrs. Dawes wept and clutched her hand. Her lips moved. Poirot bent closer, listening. "She took the key," Emily whispered. "She locked me where the others couldn't hear. She had no face, just holes where her eyes should be." Then she began to cry, quiet, gasping sobs, and Poirot gently motioned for the doctor to take her upstairs. The hall had been violated, and not by ghosts. Poirot stood slowly, watching the child disappear down the corridor in her grandmother's arms. For a moment, his face softened, the quiet anguish of a man who had seen far too many innocents caught in the crossfire of adult secrets. Then he turned sharply to the constable and the colonel, who in this house had access to the kitchen, passage, to sedatives, and to knowledge of the dumbwaiter shaft. The constable scratched his head. "Well, I suppose any of the staff know," said Poirot crisply. "It would require not just access, but intimate knowledge. Not merely the layout of the house, but its psychology. The ghosts it hides." The colonel, stiff and increasingly grim-faced, finally spoke. "There is one person, one who has served this family since Cecily's time." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "I'm speaking of Mrs. Hargrove, our former nanny. She resides in the Hall's east quarters. We pensioned her off years ago, but she never left. She says the house calms her nerves." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "She was Cecily's governess." "Yes, and she refused to leave after Cecily's disappearance. Letitia insisted on keeping her, said it would be cruel to turn out a woman who had nowhere to go." Poirot turned without another word. Mrs. Hargrove's room was tucked into a corner of the east corridor, past the scullery. The door was slightly ajar. Poirot knocked once, then stepped inside. The room was dim, draped in lace curtains yellowed with age. Photographs sat on every surface, old black and white portraits of children, some faded beyond recognition. A rocking chair faced a small fireplace, and in it sat a thin woman wrapped in a shawl, her white hair coiled into a bun so tight it stretched the lines of her face taut. She looked up as Poirot entered. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, as though expecting him. He paused. "You know who I am?" She nodded. "The house told me. I hear its voices still. They never left." Poirot moved closer. "And Cecily? Do you hear her voice?" Mrs. Hargrove's eyes flicked toward the fire. "She was troubled, poor lamb, but she was right to be afraid. The others always said she lied, but she saw her." Mrs. Hargrove leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The lady with no face. She came up from the floor. At night, when the lights were out, she watched Cecily through the keyhole. She told her secrets." Poirot said nothing. Let the silence stretch. Then Mrs. Hargrove continued, her voice strange, distant. "I tried to protect her. I told her not to speak of it, but she drew the pictures. She saw the real face, in her dreams, and so they took her." Poirot stepped forward. "Slowly. Who took her?" Mrs. Hargrove blinked. I did. Silence. I had to, she said, almost pleading now. She was going to tell. She said she would go to the police. About what she saw, about what I did to Alice. Poirot's voice was quiet. You killed Alice Dorn. Mrs. Hargrove didn't answer right away. She stared at a photograph on her nightstand, a faded image of a dark-haired girl in uniform, unsmiling. She was going to leave, said she was taking Cecily with her, said she loved her, and they would run away. I couldn't let that happen. Cecily was sick. She needed boundaries, not freedom. So you lured Alice down into the cellar. Mrs. Hargrove nodded, told her I needed help. With the old trunk, hit her with the poker. Hid her behind the larder wall. No one ever checked. No one ever suspected. The nanny. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. And Cecily, she wouldn't stop screaming. Screaming about the woman with no face. Screaming that she knew. She stopped eating. Stopped sleeping. Then one night she disappeared. I think she went looking for Alice. Poirot opened his eyes. She didn't vanish, did she? No, Mrs. Hargrove whispered. She died in the passage. Fell. Broke her neck. I buried her beneath the garden bench. The one by the rose arbor, I thought. I thought it would end there. But Emily changed that, Mrs. Hargrove said. Nothing. You saw her drawings. You realized she was seeing what Cecily had seen, or remembered it through the house's echoes. You feared she'd lead someone to the truth. The old woman nodded slowly. So you drugged her, hid her in the dumbwaiter shaft, waiting for an opportunity to move her permanently. Tears now ran down Mrs. Hargrove's wrinkled face. She reminded me of Cecily, the way she drew, the way she whispered to herself. I just wanted it all to stop. I didn't mean to hurt her. Poirot turned away, his expression grim. You did not merely hurt them, madame. You erased them. He signaled the constable, who had been waiting in the corridor. Mrs. Hargrove did not resist that evening. Poirot stood once more in the nursery, now warm and lit with soft lamplight. Emily was tucked into the old bed. Her eyes closed, but her breathing peaceful. Mrs. Dawes sat beside her, whispering a nursery rhyme. Poirot looked at the chalkboard one last time. The figure with no face was still there, but beside it, someone had drawn a new figure, small and neat, with a mustache and a hat. Emily's edition, and this one wore a smile. The next morning broke with hesitant sunlight, the kind that slips through low clouds rather than piercing them. Greybourne Hall sat heavy in its foundations, like a creature that had recently expelled something foul and now lay exhausted in its silence. The events of the previous night had spread like wildfire, though no one quite dared speak them aloud. Whispers curled through the house like smoke. The nanny, the body, she confessed. 2 girls lost. Emily was recovering well. Dr. Everett reported that she was exceedingly fortunate to have suffered no lasting harm. She remained drowsy, but her speech was returning to normal, and her nightmares had lessened. Poirot visited her only once, quietly, to sit beside her while she slept. I have no more questions for you, Petite, he had said softly. You have already told the truth, even when others refused to hear it. Now, with Mrs. Hargrove in custody and Cecily's death no longer a mystery, one might have assumed that Poirot's work was complete. It was not. At 10 o'clock, Poirot requested the presence of Colonel Greyburn, Miss Letitia, and Constable Grant in the garden. They met near the rose arbor, a beautifully cultivated crescent of trellised wood wrapped in fading pink blossoms. Autumn had stripped most of the color from the plants, leaving behind skeletal vines and scattered petals. The morning dew clung to the grass and stone benches. Here, said Poirot, pointing to the bench nearest the eastern hedge. You said, Colonel, that it has stood here since your childhood. Yes, the Colonel said cautiously. At least 40 years. Why? Poirot knelt beside the bench and brushed aside the wet leaves with a gloved hand. The soil beneath looked ordinary if slightly disturbed. He turned to the constable. You will find shovels by the potting shed. We must dig. Letitia paled. Surely, Poirot, this is grotesque. We have already found one body. Must we now unearth another? Poirot stood, brushing his knees. Yes, madam, we must. The digging was slow. Constable Grant, aided by a young groundsman, worked methodically under Poirot's watchful gaze. At first, there was nothing but roots and old mulch, then a hollow clunk of metal against stone. Moments later, a piece of fabric emerged, blue and white cotton, faded nearly gray with time, the remains of a summer dress, then bone. Letitia turned away. Colonel Greybourne removed his hat and said nothing. By midday they had uncovered what was unmistakably a shallow grave. A small skeleton, female, judging by the hip structure, curled inward as though asleep. The remains of a ribbon clung to the skull, and nearby, half buried in the dirt, was a rusted locket. Poirot knelt and opened it gently. Inside was a miniature portrait, worn nearly to invisibility, but still recognizable as the girl from the painting in the West Wing hallway. Cecily, said Poirot. Letitia closed her eyes. The constable let out a long, slow breath. God rest her. Poirot rose. She died not at the hands of a stranger. She fled, perhaps hoping to reach the cellar where Alice had vanished, or simply running from what her mind could not bear. She slipped, fell, perhaps struck her head, and Mrs. Hargrove, panicked, did what she always did when faced with an unseemly truth. She buried it. Letitia's voice was hoarse. We failed her, all of us. Poirot said nothing. Back inside, Poirot stood alone in the library as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. A small fire crackled in the grate. Though the room still held a draught, he had spread several of Emily's drawings across the table, collected from her satchel, her bedroom, and the nursery. He arranged them chronologically, tracing the evolution of the child's fears. The early ones were innocent: flowers, animals, a family of rabbits. Then came the strange ones: the red door, the woman without a face, the figure with the key, and finally, the most recent, a woman drawn in shadow, kneeling by a grave, her hands stained with color. It had not been just Cecily's ghost speaking to Emily. It had been the house itself. Poirot ran a hand down his mustache. Malfoy, Yvonne Stones, remember? That evening, as a cool wind swept over the hills, Poirot requested tea with Letitia Greybourne in the solar room. She met him with unusual quietness. Her posture was straighter than ever, but her eyes were hollow. "You have come to scold me," she said after a long silence. "No," said Poirot gently. "I have come to reflect." Letitia gave a dry laugh. "And what do you see, Monsieur Poirot, when you reflect upon me?" He sipped his tea. "I see a woman who spent her life guarding a secret she herself did not understand, who mistook silence for dignity, and duty for honor." She looked down. "I did not know what Mrs. Hargrove had done, not truly, but I suspected. I chose not to ask." Poirot nodded. "It is a comfortable illusion, madame, to think that, in doing nothing, one is innocent. But you were the guardian of this house, and this house has been unwell for a very long time." Letitia stood, walked to the window. "It ends now," she said quietly. "We will give Cecily a proper burial. And Alice Dorn too, if her name can be restored. I will speak to the papers if necessary. Let the truth be known." Poirot rose, placed his teacup gently on the tray. "And Emily, she will never return to this house," Letitia said firmly. "Not while I breathe. She deserves light, not shadows." Poirot inclined his head. "For once, madame, I find myself in agreement with you." That night, Poirot packed his valise in quiet contemplation. Hastings, had he been there, might have commented on the heaviness of his friend's expression, but Poirot said nothing. Only when he locked the final clasp did he speak aloud. "One cannot always save the child," he murmured, "but one can listen. Next time, perhaps, they will." It was a grey, windless morning when the twin funerals took place on the edge of Marleycombe village. The old church of St. Jude's, its stone tower leaning ever so slightly toward the sea, had not seen such a gathering in decades. The churchyard was silent, except for the soft murmur of wind over gravestones, and the respectful coughs of villagers who stood in heavy coats and Sunday hats, their eyes lowered, their thoughts troubled. 2 caskets rested at the front, one small, weathered, by time, the other slightly larger and newer, beneath a veil of ritual and quiet solemnity. It was understood by all that these were not ordinary burials. One was for Cecily Greybourne, the long-lost sister who had vanished 40 years earlier and had now been found in the garden she had once played in as a child. The other was for Alice Dorn, the servant girl whose name had all but vanished from the house's history, until her remains were discovered in a bricked cellar and her murder confessed by the woman meant to protect them both. Letitia Greybourne stood stiffly at the front, her black gloves clasped tightly in front of her, her hat's veil concealing most of her expression. Colonel Greybourne stood beside her, solemn and grim. They were not visibly weeping. The Greybournes rarely did, but Poirot, watching from a modest seat near the back, saw the tension in Letitia's jaw, the barely perceptible tremble in her hands. Guilt, perhaps, was something subtler. Shame. Emily Dawes did not attend. Dr. Everett had advised against it, and Mrs. Dawes, grateful beyond words, had taken her granddaughter to a friend's cottage near Dartmoor to recover fully in peace. Poirot approved. The child had seen enough of Greybourne Hall's secrets. After the burial, Poirot lingered in the churchyard, gazing not at the graves, but at the mist creeping along the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the grounds. Constable Grant approached quietly. "She'll be arraigned next week," he said softly. "Mrs. Hargrove. Yes, the confession is ironclad. There'll be no trial. She's elderly, confused, but not mad. She knew what she was doing." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and she chose silence, as did many." The constable cleared his throat. "And the family, they will recover. Families always do, or pretend to." He looked over at the Greybournes, now walking slowly toward their motor car. "She will attempt to restore dignity through charity, or through a published statement. But what was buried will not be forgotten again." Grant hesitated. "And you, sir, are you leaving?" Poirot gave a faint smile. "Soon, but not quite yet." That afternoon, back at the Hall, Poirot did something he rarely did. He made himself a guest. He took lunch alone in the small morning room, requesting a plain, poached egg, buttered toast, and a single cup of black coffee. He ate slowly, staring out across the lawn, as the last of the autumn leaves spiraled to the earth. Then he requested a fire be lit in the library, and summoned everyone remaining in the house, family, staff, and local witnesses to gather. That evening, at precisely 7 o'clock, as the grandfather clock chimed, they entered the library and found Poirot already waiting beside the hearth. The fire cast long shadows on the walls. Flickering against rows of books and oil portraits of unsmiling Greybourne ancestors, Letitia sat nearest the fireplace, Colonel Greybourne beside her, the vicar, Dr. Everett, the gardener, the cook, the groundsman, even the young footman, all filed in. Constable Grant stood to one side, not interfering. Poirot remained standing. "I have called you here," he began, "not to reveal a murder that, as you know, has already been confessed, but to examine the reason behind so many silences, why so many people, over so many years, refuse to speak." He glanced at Letitia. "It is not because they did not suspect the truth. It is because the truth was too inconvenient." Letitia opened her mouth, but Poirot held up a hand. "I do not say this to assign blame, but it must be said. The child Cecily saw something. She tried to draw it, to speak of it. She cried out, but her cries were interpreted as madness. The child Emily, decades later, did the same. And again, she was nearly lost." He turned to the room as a whole. "When a child tells you they are afraid of the shadows, you must look, not laugh. You must listen." There was silence. Poirot stepped to the mantelpiece and retrieved a folded paper. He opened it, revealing a final drawing found tucked beneath Emily's mattress that morning. It showed a room, the cellar, and a series of red lines, as though showing movement. A black shape moved from the stairs toward the door. Another figure crouched in a corner, and at the bottom, written in large, childlike scrawl, "She watches where others forget." Poirot looked around slowly. This was not Emily's fantasy. It was her memory. She was locked away, and yet her little grey cells worked being served. They saw, they remembered. He placed the drawing on the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, the ghosts of Greybourne were not spirits. They were the consequences of silence." After the gathering, Letitia approached Poirot alone. "You didn't have to humiliate me," she said flatly. "I did not," Poirot replied. "I humiliated no one. I spoke only of a truth that too many pretended not to see." Letitia was quiet. "Then, what will happen to us now?" Poirot regarded her with something close to pity. "That, madame, is entirely up to you, but I advise you start by telling the truth to yourselves, not just to others." He picked up his hat, adjusted his cuffs, "And next time a child draws a monster in the dark, do not assume it is only imagination." He turned for the door. "Because sometimes, madame, it is a portrait." Though the public resolution had been reached, the murderer identified, the graves found, the child rescued, Hercule Poirot was not yet satisfied. To the outside world, justice had been done. Mrs. Hargrove had confessed, Cecily's remains had been unearthed, and Greybourne Hall could at last mourn its forgotten ghosts. And yet, there remained something wrong, a discordant note beneath the piano's last chord, an expression on a face just a second too late to be innocent, and Poirot could not leave until he uncovered it. He began, as ever, by turning inward to the realm of psychology. That afternoon, he walked the halls of Greybourne slowly, not to search for evidence, but to test the atmosphere. He moved from room to room, the scullery, the former nursery, the library, the upper corridor where the portrait of Cecily now hung alone, watching for dust disturbed, for curtains drawn differently, for subtle signs of presence or avoidance. When he entered the conservatory, an elegant glass-domed room off the east wing, filled with overgrown potted palms and long-forgotten wicker furniture, he found Colonel Marcus Greybourne seated alone, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his gaze distant. "Ah, Colonel," said Poirot with warmth, "a private drink to clear the fog of the past." The Colonel started. "I thought you'd gone." "Soon, yes," Poirot replied. "But not quite yet. I had something on my mind, a small thread." The Colonel took a sip, then said gruffly, "There are no more threads left to pull. Poirot, we've buried the dead. The ghosts have gone." Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. "Are you so certain, mon Colonel?" He took a seat beside the man, choosing a chair with a view of the sea. "Past," he said slowly, "does not leave us simply because we perform a burial. Sometimes, it waits until we are comfortable, until we believe we are safe, and then it knocks on the back of the mind." The Colonel looked uneasy. "If you've something to say it, man." Poirot's tone shifted. "You have been silent about Cecily all these years. I understand why. But I wonder, are you truly innocent in your silence? Or did you fear that Cecily might someday speak not only of Alice Dorn but of you?" The Colonel's face stiffened. Poirot pressed gently. "She drew pictures. She wrote of someone with a key, a figure watching her. And in Emily's latest drawing, the same figure appears again, with the key." The Colonel stood, his face flushed. "Are you accusing me of harming my sister?" "No," said Poirot calmly. "I am accusing you of knowing more than you have admitted." The Colonel clenched his jaw. "I saw the signs. Hargrove was manipulating her, controlling her. I told Letitia we had to remove her, but she wouldn't listen. She was too proud. And yet," said Poirot, "when Cecily vanished, you accepted the story of her suicide without investigation. You locked her room. You told no one, not even the police." Silence. Poirot stood. "I shall leave you now, Colonel, but remember, even the strongest walls cracked from within." That evening, Poirot invited Letitia Greybourne, Colonel Marcus, Dr. Everett, Constable Grant, and the house staff to join him in the library for a final discussion. Not a formal gathering, not quite, but a moment of shared reflection. Trap. The room was quiet as Poirot stood before the hearth. "There is one matter," he began, "which continues to trouble me." He turned to the group. "Mrs. Hargrove confessed to 2 deaths, Alice Dawn and Cecily. And yet, there are 3 drawings by Emily in which a figure with a key appears. Always with the key. Always unlocking a door." He placed the sketches on the mantel one by one, the first in the garden, the second in the nursery, the third behind the cellar door. Poirot's voice sharpened. "And in each drawing the figure is not a woman." Letitia frowned. "What are you saying?" Poirot faced the room. "I am saying that Emily, like Cecily, saw someone else. Someone alive. A man. And this man tried to silence her." Gasps echoed. Poirot turned his eyes to Colonel Greyburn. "You, monsieur, had the cellar key, not Mrs. Hargrove. You alone accessed the larder's outer door, and it was you who unlocked the passage through which Emily was taken." The colonel said nothing. Poirot stepped forward. "You did not kill Alice Dawn. That was Hargrove. But you helped bury Cecily because she didn't fall. She found the bones. She confronted you, she knew. And in your shame, your fury, you struck her." Letitia rose in horror. Marcus Poirot continued. "You left the body in the garden and let Hargrove cover for you. You said nothing and you lived in peace. Until Emily, until she drew the same key, saw the same shape in the dark, and you knew it was beginning again." Poirot turned to the constable. "You will find, in the colonel's desk drawer, a green crayon snapped in half, and a vial of chloral hydrate from his hunting kit." The colonel's shoulders slumped. He said nothing. Letitia whispered. "God, Marcus." Poirot spoke not as an accuser but as a mourner. "You silenced 2 children, Colonel. One died, one nearly did. But in the end, it was a child's drawing. Simple, honest, impossible to reason with, that betrayed you." The colonel looked up slowly. "I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted her to stop asking, stop drawing." Poirot nodded solemnly. "But children do not stop, mon colonel. They draw what they cannot say. They repeat what adults bury." As the colonel was led away by Constable Grant, Poirot turned to Letitia, who stood frozen by the window. "This house," he said softly, "will not be free until truth has lived in it longer than lies." Letitia said nothing. She simply turned, and for the first time in a long, long while she wept. A heavy silence had fallen over Greyburn Hall. The storm had passed, not one of wind or rain, but of secrets. Colonel Marcus Greyburn was in custody. Mrs. Hargrove, though frail and confined to a cell in Dorchester, had given a full, chilling statement. And for the first time in living memory, Letitia Greyburn had shut the front gates of Greyburn Hall to the outside world. Inside the library, however, Hercule Poirot stood as composed as ever, flanked by a small gathering of those still tethered to the truth. The library fire had been reduced to glowing embers. The grandfather clock ticked precisely. Poirot, immaculate in a grey 3-piece suit with a blue cravat, stood at the hearthrug, eyes closed, fingers pressed together. Then he began. "I have, Ms. Amos, the honor to bring to its conclusion this tragic and terrible affair. It is not the kind of mystery I take pleasure in. No puzzle box murder with clever motives or criminal genius, Nan. It is a story of silence, of guilt, of memory." He opened his eyes slowly, and most of all, of children who remembered what adults wished to forget. He turned to those assembled. Letitia Greyburn sat upright, her face pale but composed. Dr. Everett leaned on the back of a chair. Mrs. Dawes, summoned back to the hall, once it was safe, sat with Emily asleep on her lap, and Constable Grant stood by the door, silent and grim. "Let us begin with the known," Poirot said. "We believed, at first, that Emily Dawes had wandered off, then that she had been taken by whom, we did not yet know. When she was found concealed in the old dumbwaiter shaft, drugged but alive, we believed the culprit to be Mrs. Hargrove, the old nursemaid who confessed to killing Alice Dawn decades before. He turned, and she did. Of that, there is no doubt. In 1930, in a fit of control and jealousy, she lured Alice to the cellar, murdered her, and hid her body behind a false wall. Cecily, the youngest Greyburn, discovered this horror. She told the truth, as children often do. She drew it, she whispered it, and so she became dangerous." Poirot stepped away from the fire. Mrs. Hargrove, fearing exposure, colluded with Colonel Marcus Greyburn, or perhaps he offered protection, a convenient silence. And then, one night, Cecily disappeared. Letitia closed her eyes, slowly. "But Cecily did not run away," Poirot continued. "She was murdered, not by Mrs. Hargrove, but by her brother. Cecily had found Alice's remains, perhaps even confronted him. Perhaps she spoke too loudly. Perhaps she threatened the name of the family. We shall never know the exact words." He turned and faced a window, arms behind his back. "But we know this. She was struck hard enough to kill. Her body was buried beneath the rose arbor, and her death blamed on madness and misadventure." Poirot let the statement settle, and it might have remained buried, were it not for the forgotten drawing of a child. He retrieved a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it up. This sketch, simple, red crayon unfolded paper, was drawn by Emily the morning before she vanished. It shows the figure with the key. The same figure, Cecily described. The same figure Emily later saw in the corridor before she was taken. Poirot paced slowly. I examined the angle of the drawing. I compared it to the view from the nursery window, and I realized she had drawn what she saw outside. He turned sharply. She saw Marcus Graybourne unlocking the cellar door. That was the trigger. That was when he knew the past had surfaced again, in the form of a child with crayons. Mrs. Dawes gasped softly. Emily stirred in her arms but did not wake. Poirot continued. He followed her, drugged her, hid her in the dumbwaiter shaft, intending to move her elsewhere once the hall was quiet. Perhaps to a more permanent place. But Poirot does not sleep when a child is missing. No, he gave a small, sad smile. I traced the crayon, the footprint in the pantry, the vial of chloral hydrate in his hunting drawer, and, above all, the drawings. They were consistent, logical, patterned. Children do not invent keys, they see. Then Poirot turned to Letitia at last. You, madame, saw all of this, but not clearly. You buried your doubts beneath dignity, but dignity cannot grow where blood is in the soil. Letitia looked away. I never imagined Marcus because it was easier not to, Poirot said, gently but firmly. But there is no safety in silence, only delay. He stepped back. Now the hall must reckon with its memory. The doors once locked must remain open. Cecily's room, the cellar, the nursery. He turned to Mrs. Dawes. Take Emily far from here. Let her draw bright things now. Gardens, birds, sunshine. The monsters have been named. Their power has ended. Mrs. Dawes, tears in her eyes, nodded. Poirot looked to Constable Grant. My duty is done. The police have the confessions, the evidence, the truth. The constable nodded respectfully, looked around the room once more. Then, softly, almost to himself, he said, Children speak in pictures when words are too heavy, but they always speak. That night, as Poirot left Graybourne Hall for the final time, the mist lifted slightly. The moon shone down upon the lawn, upon the hedges, and upon the rose arbor beneath which his sister had slept too long in the back of the car. Poirot opened a small envelope that Emily had given him earlier. It contained one last drawing. A house, tall, grey, and watchful, a little girl, holding the hand of a man with a round hat and a mustache, and a single word, written in the corner, Mercy. It was several days later, and the world had resumed its quiet turning. The newspapers had begun to forget the story. The Dorset Echo ran a single-column headline. Graybourne Hall remains identified. Family requests privacy. A smaller piece in the Illustrated London News called Poirot's actions commendable, though it mostly focused on the architectural curiosities of the old estate. Graybourne Hall itself stood silent, its windows darkened, its grand iron gates shut. Letitia Graybourne had left for the continent for treatment. The papers guessed, though Poirot suspected it was not her body that needed mending. The constable confirmed that Colonel Marcus Graybourne had confessed in full. The law would proceed, but leniently. An aging veteran, remorseful, bound by decades of silence, had little strength left for defiance. Poirot, when asked to testify, declined politely. The truth had already spoken. He need not embellish it. And, as for Emily, she recovered quickly. Her drawings changed. Gone were the red doors and key-holding figures. She now drew bright cottages, tall sunflowers, and a certain gentleman with an elaborate mustache, who always wore a neat coat and never looked away. Poirot received a letter from her grandmother. It read, She says your head is full of mirrors. That's how you see what others don't. He smiled at that dot. Now, in the sitting room of a small hotel in Lyme Regis, Poirot sat before the sea, a cup of thick Belgian chocolate in his hands, and Hastings' last postcard tucked in his coat pocket. No murder, no drawing, no buried guilt, just the sea and the wind. And yet, his mind was not at rest, for mysteries such as this one, where the past curdles in silence and innocence is traded. For shame never sit easily with him, he reflected. C'est curieux, he murmured to himself. It was not the body, nor the motive, nor the locked door that solved the mystery. He stirred his chocolate once, slowly. It was the child who saw what the grown people would not. Poirot's gaze drifted toward the waves. You see, Hastings' children do not lie as adults do. Their lies are clumsy, transparent, but their truths, those are terrible truths because they do not know how to soften them. He took a sip and placed the cup down. Cecily tried to speak. She was silenced. Emily tried to draw. She was taken. But in the end it was their drawings that cracked the facade. A pencil and a crayon accomplished what all the police reports could not. Poirot rose and walked slowly toward the window, hands folded behind him. I sometimes think that in childhood we all see clearly, and it is only later that we choose to go blind. Outside, the seabirds cried over the surf. A boy ran past the glass, laughing, his paper kite dancing behind him in bright loops. Poirot smiled faintly. Before leaving the hotel, he took out a sheet of paper and began to write. Not for the newspapers, not for the police. Just a note, brief, careful, private. To Mademoiselle Emily Dawes. You were brave, you were honest, and you remembered. Never let anyone take that away from you, Hercule Poirot. He folded the note, placed it in a cream-colored envelope, and addressed it in tidy, looping script. As he handed it to the concierge with strict instructions to forward, he gave his final reflection not to anyone in particular, but to the air itself. The crime, he said, was not the murder, it was the forgetting. And, with that, he placed his hat gently upon his head, adjusted the line of his tie, and walked out into the morning. 2 weeks had passed since Hercule Poirot left Greybourne Hall behind. The headlines had faded, and the local gossips of Marleycombe had found fresher scandal in the vicar's new housekeeper and a cow that escaped from Butterley Farm and wandered into the church during evening mass. But not everyone had forgotten. In a modest drawing-room at Meadowview Cottage, a small house overlooking the village green, Emily Dawes sat at a table with colored pencils laid out in a careful rainbow row. Her grandmother, Mrs. Dawes, bustled about the kitchen, humming a letter sat beside Emily on the table, worn at the corners from many rereadings. You were brave, you were honest, and you remembered never let anyone take that away from you. Hercule Poirot. Millie touched the page gently, as though the words might still be warm from the pen. She had drawn a new picture, not of the hall, not of the nursery, not even of Poirot, but of Cecily, a girl in a summer dress, swinging from an elm tree, laughing, a ribbon in her hair. Behind her a second girl, slightly older, watching from the shadows with curiosity and wonder. It was labeled, The Girl Who Saw First. Emily didn't show the drawing to anyone. She folded it carefully and slipped it between the pages of a book on the shelf she would remember. That was enough. Elsewhere, in London, Poirot sat once more in his comfortable apartment on Whitehaven Mansions, his morning paper folded neatly, his egg perfectly soft-boiled, his slippers precisely aligned. Miss Lemon, his secretary, tapped gently on the door. A package has arrived, Monsieur Poirot. No return address. Mercy, Miss Lemon. Place it on the table. She did so and retreated with her usual quiet efficiency. Poirot opened the brown parcel with care. Inside was a sketchbook, the pages thick, the edges stained with crayon marks. A ribbon had been tied around it in green thread. There was a card. Monsieur Poirot, Emily insisted you have it. She said you were the only one who would understand all the drawings, even the ones we don't. With thanks. Mrs. Poirot smiled. He untied the ribbon and began to flip through the pages. There were pictures of gardens, teacups, smiling people, and strange little creatures. But near the end was one last image. It was Emily again, holding Cecily's hand, and behind them stood Greybourne Hall. But the windows were no longer grey. They were glowing yellow with light. That evening, Hastings rang from Argentina. My dear fellow, came the voice on the line. You'll never believe the business I've got caught up in. A missing parrot, a jealous widow, and a poisoned marmalade tin. The usual. Poirot chuckled. And you, have you used your little grey cells? Not as well as you, I imagine. Pardieu too. It is not the size of the brain, Hastings. It is the clarity of its mirror. Poirot leaned back in his chair. I have just solved a case where the clue was a crayon. Uncrayon. And yet, it solved what 40 years of silence could not. Hastings laughed. You never cease to surprise. Men know, mon ami. But it is the children who surprise me most. They speak the truth, and we learn to forget it. That night, before retiring, Poirot placed the sketchbook carefully on a shelf beside his rare books and case journals. He looked out the window across the city skyline. The case of the forgotten child's drawing was complete. But somewhere, he thought, somewhere in the quiet corners of dusty homes, under beds, behind curtains, children still drew what adults dared not see. And perhaps one day, one of them would pick up a crayon again and tell the truth. Chapter 13. The Portrait. In the attic 2 months later, on a morning thick with winter fog, a sealed letter arrived at Whitehaven Mansions. It bore no return address, but the script was unmistakably formal. A practiced hand used to ledgers, inventories, and condolences. Poirot examined it thoughtfully, before breaking the wax seal with the blade of a letter opener. Monsieur Poirot, you may be interested to know that Greybourne Hall has been closed for the season. I have taken residence in a smaller property in Wiltshire. The hall will not reopen until spring, if at all. Marcus has been committed to a secure hospital facility. He no longer speaks, except to repeat his sister's name. We have begun the work of sorting the archives. Among the boxes I found a small portrait. It had been hidden behind one of Cecily's watercolors, in the attic where Mrs. Hargrove once stored the nursery items. The subject of the portrait is a woman in servant's uniform, smiling. On the back, in Cecily's hand, were written 3 words. She loved me. I thought you should know. Letitia Greybourne Epperett closed the letter. Slowly. Alice Dorn, he murmured. Erased by the household, but never by the child who loved her. That same afternoon, Poirot visited his favorite bookseller on Chancery Lane. It was a small, musty shop with bell chimes that rang like whispers and shelves that bowed under the weight of forgotten memoirs and annotated classics. Looking for anything in particular, Monsieur Poirot? Asked the old proprietor. Mr. Latchbury, oui mon ami. Something modest, a book for a child, but not a foolish one. A book with truth, disguised as wonder. Latchbury grinned and reached beneath the counter. How about this? The Secret, Garden First Edition. Bit worn at the spine, but the magic is intact. Poirot turned the book in his hands, ran a finger down the cover. It is perfect. He purchased it without haggling, rare for him, and had it wrapped in brown paper with a green ribbon. On the inside cover, he inscribed, "For Emily Dawes, in whose eyes the truth could not be hidden, and in whose drawings it finally spoke." He posted it that evening with satisfaction. Back in Montlecombe, spring had not yet come, but the crocuses had begun to push their way through the frost. Emily received the package. Just before breakfast, she opened it slowly, her breath catching at the title, her fingers tracing the cover. She read Poirot's message 3 times. Then she ran to her satchel, pulled out a fresh piece of paper, and began to draw. It was not a mystery, it was not a ghost, it was a garden walled, hidden, but alive, and standing in its center was a little girl with a ribbon in her hair. Beside her stood a woman in a maid's uniform, holding her hand, and in the sky above them, as though watching from a distance, a small figure with a mustache and round hat smiled faintly from a bench. She folded the drawing and she placed it inside the book in London. Poirot sat in his armchair with a cup of tisane, the lamplight, warm and golden around him. On his table lay a newspaper folded neatly to the crossword. He had not spoken of the Greybourne affair again, not to Hastings, not to Scotland Yard, not even to Miss Lemon. But now and then, when the flat was quiet and the city murmured softly outside, he would glance toward the shelf where the sketchbook rested, and he would think of the girl who drew the truth, of the sister who was not mad, only alone, and of the house that, like all houses, remembered more than it dared to admit. Spring arrived early that year in Dorset. By March, the air was already soft with a scent of thawing earth and budding green, and the once shuttered windows of Marleycomb's cottages were flung open to let in light. Children chalked hopscotch, squares on the pavements, bees returned to gardens long left barren, and in the small village post office a card arrived bearing a Brussels postmark and delicate, looping script. It was addressed to Miss Emily Dawes, CO, Meadowview Cottage, Dorset. Inside was a single line: "You were the first to see. Never forget how brightly that gift shines." Hercule Poirot smiled. She placed the card on her bookshelf, beside the secret garden. She did not draw the lady with no face anymore, nor did she have nightmares of narrow dark spaces or cellar doors. But she remembered always, and somewhere in her memory, the voice of a careful Belgian detective still murmured softly, "The little grey cells. Mademoiselle, they are never wrong." Greybourne Hall stood silent. The gravel drive was overgrown, ivy had begun to reclaim the eastern side. Birds nested in the eaves, but it was not a haunted place now, not cursed, not evil, just empty. The rose arbor, once a grave, now bloomed again, not in pinks or whites, but deep, bold crimson. A new stone had been placed there. Cecily Greybourne, 1919 to 1930. She saw the truth, and was not believed. A smaller marker nearby, read, Alice Dawn, unknown, -1930, love never forgotten. Sometimes, on warm days, children from the village would wander onto the grounds, peer into the broken windows, and whisper stories. They spoke of secret staircases, of hidden rooms, of women with keys and men who couldn't look you in the eye. They didn't know the full story, but the house did. The house always remembered, far from Greybourne. In a sunlit study above Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot placed a single final note into his case files. On the label he wrote, "The forgotten child's drawing, a case solved not by footprint or fingerprint, but by crayon, and by the truth children carry long after grown minds forget how to see." He slid the folder into the cabinet and locked it with a quiet click. Then he made himself a tisane, adjusted the creases in his cuffs, and returned to his crossword. The clues, after all, were always there. One only had to learn how to see them. In the weeks following the Greybourne revelations, time did what it always does, moved forward. The world outside Marleycombe forgot quickly, as it always does. Another scandal took its place in the headlines. Another photograph appeared in the society pages. Another tragedy surfaced in another village, but within the quiet lanes of Dorset and in the corners of a child's memory. The aftershocks continued like whispers in a long hallway. Mrs. Dawes never returned to Greybourne Hall, nor did she speak of it again, except once when Emily asked where it was on the map. "It's a place some people live in only with locked doors," she said softly, "and others walk out of with the courage to draw again." Emily Dawes began school again in April. Her teachers noted, with some concern, that she was quiet, observant, and always sketching. But after a while, they began to admire her work, not for technical perfection, but for its clarity. She drew what others missed. One teacher, an art instructor named Miss Cleary, wrote in her report, "Emily sees in shapes and silences. She tells stories with color. Her pictures are full of people with secrets. She would one day be offered a scholarship. But that is another story." In London, Poirot kept her final drawing tucked behind glass on his desk, a private keepsake, not for public display. It showed 3 figures: a young girl, a woman in a servant's cap, and a great grey house behind them. What stood out, however, was that the house no longer loomed. It didn't frown or bend inward with shadows. It stood peacefully, with light in the windows, and flowers at its base. Poirot would glance at it now and then during quiet mornings, and on more than one occasion, Miss Lemon found him smiling gently at it. One fine day in early summer, Hastings returned from Argentina and joined Poirot for lunch at the Ritz. They spoke of many things: ships, Argentine cattle, Hastings' ever-unfolding romantic misadventures. Eventually, Hastings leaned in. "I read about the Greybourne case. Ghastly business. Still marvelously handled by you, old chap." Poirot dabbed his mouth delicately. "Mercy, Hastings. But do you know, it was not my little grey cells that solved this case." Hastings looked up, startled. "No." Poirot shook his head. "It was the grey crayons of a little girl. She did what none of us could. She told the truth without disguise, and for that, lives were saved. The dead were remembered, and the shadows retreated, if only slightly." He tapped his temple gently. "But of course, it helps to have a detective who listens when children speak." On his walk home, Poirot passed a toy shop window. Inside were puzzles, chessboards, and a small sketchpad with colored pencils in neat order. He entered the shop and bought two. One he mailed to Emily Dawes, the other he kept just in case. Because, sometimes, in the quiet moments between mysteries, even Hercule Poirot wished to remember the world as a child saw it, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a picture to understand. It was late evening in London, and Whitehaven Mansions was wrapped in the hush that follows a case well concluded. The lights of the city blinked gently beyond Poirot's windows, and the air held the scent of rain to come. Poirot sat alone in his armchair, a checked blanket folded neatly over his knees, a volume of Balzac resting unread on the table beside him. The room was warm, but his thoughts were cool, sharp as ever, for there was one matter remaining. One clue that had never been explained aloud. One clue that had not led to a killer, but to something else entirely. He rose and walked to his case cabinet from a lower drawer. He withdrew the sketchbook Emily had sent. Most of the pages had been examined thoroughly. The red crayon, the figure with the key, the house with no face. But it was one of the earliest drawings that held Poirot's attention now. It showed a garden not unusual and a small door beside it, at the base of a great house. But in the background was a second building, one that had never been part of the official records. A long, narrow annex with a peculiar chimney and a slanted roof. Poirot had seen such buildings before. It was not a stable, it was a laundry house. He remembered his conversation with Mrs. Dawes weeks earlier, how she'd mentioned that Emily once asked her, "Why does the laundry lady cry on Mondays?" Mrs. Dawes had thought it a child's invention. But Poirot knew better. The next morning, Poirot visited the Marleycombe archives, housed in a room above the village library. He requested old estate maps and staff registers. The librarian, curious but compliant, handed him a cracked leather folder marked Greybourne, 1910 to 1935. Poirot examined the building plans. There it was, laundry house, demolished in 1931. He turned to the personnel records. Under servants discharged, deceased, he found Maud Hargrove, laundress, sister to Nanny Eleanor Hargrove, deceased 1931, accidental fall, washing stair. Poirot stared at the note for a long time. A sister. Mrs. Hargrove had never mentioned her, not once. A laundress who died the year Cecily disappeared, the year the cellar was sealed, the year Marcus Greybourne buried his sister beneath the roses, and Emily, a child, nearly a century later had drawn her building. Poirot returned to London with his answer. It had not been ghosts that spoke to Emily, it had been grief. Grief so deeply buried in Greybourne's stones that it hummed through floorboards and doorframes like a lullaby sung out of tune. It was not just Cecily who had died, Maud to an accidental fall, perhaps provoked by a quarrel. A sister silenced. And Eleanor, the woman the world knew as Mrs. Hargrove, had lost more than anyone realized. She had lost everything: her sister, her job, her control, and eventually her mind. Poirot did not share this discovery, not with the police, not with Letitia, not even with Emily. Some truths, he believed, did not belong in courtrooms or case files. They were meant only for reflection, so that those who lived might live better, more honestly. That night, he penned his final note, one never sent, addressed simply to the house itself. "You kept your secrets well, far too well, but even stone speaks when the right child listens. May you rest now, not forgotten, but forgiven." He folded the note, sealed it, and placed it in the sketchbook. Then he tucked the book away on a high shelf. As the rain began to patter gently against the windows, Poirot sat back in his chair, eyes half closed. There would be other cases, other puzzles. But this one, the forgotten child's drawing, would remain unlike any other, not for its blood, not for its darkness, but for its quietest clue. A drawing, and the belief that children often see what grown men have trained themselves not to.